Welcome to Everyday Office. This is the podcast about making the tedious parts of your job a little less tedious and the interesting parts of your job a little more interesting. Today, I'm joined by David Ringstrom. Hi, David.
Hi, Neil.
David's a CPA. He's an author. He's a nationally recognized instructor. He teaches dozens and dozens of webinars every year and has built up an Excel expertise and a curriculum over 25 years of consulting and being a CPA. So I think you can see exactly why he's on the show. I'm going to get straight into his brain in just a second here. But really, it's David's generosity that made me take notice of him and why I asked him to be on the show. He's constantly writing articles. He's sharing his expertise on Twitter, just contributing to the dialogue around best practices, tools, tips and tricks, efficiency, and everything else within Excel. And of course, as a CPA, he's got loads of experience about that optimization of Excel. So I think every one of us can learn from, the best practices and things like that. Today, David and I thought that one of the most valuable things that he could bring to the table would be to talk about disaster recovery, but also disaster prevention. We were just talking about that right before the recording started, that once the horse is out of the barn, right? It's a tough situation to be in. So we're going to talk about what we can do to solve for when things go horribly wrong, and also how we can prevent things from going horribly wrong in the first place. So David, let's start with that.
Okay.
Let's say somebody has been messing around with your spreadsheet. Are there tools that we can use to go back and solve for that? And or what do we need to do to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't get that far along the path in the first place?
The tools, if you're using older versions of Excel, are fairly limited in the event that you have shared a workbook. And so in Office 365, they've kind of relegated sharing, the old method of sharing, which we went to the review menu. But if you share your workbook the old way, Excel maintained an audit log of all the changes that were made. So that's kind of gone away in favor of this cloud-based sharing using OneDrive and Office 365. So that's definitely one angle. Within Office 365, which is the subscription-based version of Excel, where it gets confusing is there's different flavors and different varieties of Office 365, but there's one version that's called Pro Plus, and that Pro Plus version has an Inquire add-in. So it's kind of maddening how they do this because they bury stuff. You have to know that it's there to even ask for it. But if we went, let's say, to our file menu, we went down to options, and then within our Excel options, there's an add-ins section. If it's supported in your version of Excel, once you go to add-ins there, you can click go, and Inquire is going to be on the list there. Now, to actually get to it, we actually have to even go a bit more specific. So under options, under add-ins, we have to pull down that little choice there and choose the COM add-ins. So the default choice is the Excel add-ins. You got to go even more geeky and choose COM add-ins. We get checkbox for Inquire. If you have Inquire, you can turn that on. And one of the cool things that it offers is a compare files feature, which Microsoft Word has long had. With Word, you can compare two documents. Compare those two versions. The Pro Plus Office 365 offers us that. Now, apart from that, there are third-party auditing tools out there. But realistically, my biggest defense is to make sure I've got different versions of my file. So periodically, I'm working on a file, I will just have a naming convention where it's the file, and then I come up with a version number like 1.01. And then if I'm going to do something major, 1.02, and give myself those fallback spots so that I can kind of go back and roll back and see where it was. Or depending on the spreadsheet, password protecting the file. But it depends. There's no hard and fast rules in Excel because everybody's doing different things. Everyone's collaborating different ways. So the keeping as many copies, meaningful copies, so not just keeping copies, but actually having that numbered sequence has gone a long way for helping me make sure that I'm using the latest version, and also clients, because clients, the players will change. They'll grab an old version of the file and say, this is broken. Yeah, I know, reaching the quality. So having that numbering convention where everyone knows, okay, this is the latest, this is the gospel, that's been my
Hmm.
biggest defense over the years.
That makes so much sense. Yeah, my work is so heavily weighted towards training that when I get into consulting work, I don't think as much about that client interaction. And then you're absolutely right, you get that immediate feedback, this thing is broken. Okay. What version do you have open? Okay, send me what you have and then I'll compare it and everything else. So really just clean version names right there in the file name, things like that.
Right.
Nice.
That, and then bigger organizations have like SharePoint where you can like check a file out, and then that will have
Mhm.
that version management. Or if you are using Microsoft's OneDrive service, then it has versioning built in too. And in fact, with Office 365, if you choose to put your files on OneDrive, and I'm having some reticence doing that, but I've been sitting with
Mhm.
it today because I have all my files on Dropbox. What's really the difference if I have Dropbox having access to all my stuff versus Microsoft having? So I have this old school muscle memory,
Right.
you know, bias I'm having to work through. But
Mhm.
with Office 365, if you are saving your files on OneDrive, you can
Mhm.
set autosave where it comes on, and it truly saves every change you make. Now, to me, that's double edged though, because lots of times in Excel, I don't know where I'm headed. I want to open up a file, I want to head down a path and realize it went the wrong way, close the file, and start over. And if it's saving every change, then all of a sudden, you got to kind of work your way back through the timestamps. So there's so much of solve one problem and create a new problem.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, with the autosave thing, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, if you go up to the quick access toolbar up at the top of your screen and you have saved it in either SharePoint or OneDrive, that autosave slider will be there in Office 365 and it'll be turned on by default. And, in your scenario, like I said, every little change gets saved and you're not sure that that's a good idea. In my situation, when I'm creating training materials, a lot of times I'll have random generators to output new information and things like that, and it constantly resaving the modifications. Or if I have it open during a webinar, it's saving all the changes that I'm making during the webinar. I have to make
Right.
sure to
Yes.
flip that switch back off. So I'm like, no, I just want to close it and not save it and not have messed anything up.
Well, and the other defense then that you can do is if you go to the file, so if it's in OneDrive, if you go to the file menu, you can choose Save Copy As. That
Mm,
you pull it down and say put it on your desktop so that you can have that throwaway copy. And during webinars, I make really sure that before I change a file, I save it on my desktop so that I can just sweep it out rather than
exactly.
seeing my clean example that I start with.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. So I think one of the biggest ones when we talk disaster recovery or disaster prevention is just the crash of Excel. I know that for some of my large tax and accounting clients, that having ridiculous data sets sent to you
Uh-huh.
and trying to open those in Excel is constantly crashing it and things like that. Are there things that we can do either to come back from the crash, and or what can we do to prevent those types of crashes in the first place?
The biggest thing that I have figured out to prevent crashes is to eliminate the temp files from my computer periodically.
Really?
And those temp files hang out in Windows. And an easy way to get to that, I'm just going to share my screen for a second because this is
Hmm.
a little bit geeky. So, just so we can kind of see what those steps are, what we can do here is let's say we click on Windows. If you just type the percent sign, type the word temp, and then type another percent sign, and then press enter, that's going
Hmm.
to put you into this temporary files folder. Now, Windows is supposed to do its own housekeeping. And what this area is, basically, it's a scratch area where these are all files that get created in the background while you're doing work, while you're printing or working on spreadsheets, whatever. Windows is supposed to clear this out, but it doesn't. It's sloppy about it. And I, through a lot of, repeated crashes and getting frustrated, have realized that if I keep if I, in fact, I've gone to the point of setting up a batch file that just nukes this file when I log my computer, or nukes this folder, because there's nothing in here you need to keep.
Wow.
And you can't,
Huh.
some of the files are in use, so you're not going to be able to get rid of everything. But if you just go into that file,
Hmm.
so in fact, just to back up, if we go to our start menu, if you're using Windows 7 still, which I just finally got my training computer off of Windows 7 just under the day, but
You finally let go.
you're going to go to run. But Windows 10, you can just click on that start button. And when you click on the start button, you just, like you're typing in thin air, type a %, temp, and a %, press enter. And then we're just going to press Control A. That highlights everything.
Hmm.
Press delete. And, right now it says 177 items selected. We're going to go through here. It's probably going to have a couple thousand by the time it's done, because it can be misleading, like there's not as much stuff there. So it says 295. Okay, now it's starting to kind of go up there. So certain files is not going to let you do it. So you just click do this for all items,
Hmm.
say,
Right.
and just kind of let it go through. So again, because I have my computer wipe this out when I start, I don't have that many files. But my experience, when you get thousands of files in there, makes Excel, particularly the newer versions of Excel. The older versions weren't as hair trigger. The
Uh-huh.
Office 365 has very much been just hair trigger crashing. And I've seen that because I've got a pretty complex tool I use to build my presentations. And so I only recently moved that off of Excel 2010 because I was still using Excel 2010 for stability purposes. So now I'm finally migrating that tool to Office 365, but I could do things in Excel 2010, wouldn't blow it up. Same actions in Excel 2000 or Office 365 would blow it up if I had a bunch of files in the temp folder. New
Hmm.
folder, and then the computer is much more stable. So,
Interesting.
from a preventing standpoint, that's the biggest thing that I've found that's made a big difference. So, the other thing that has made a dramatic difference for me from a prevention standpoint is if we just hop into Excel for just a moment here, and we can do this in any version of Excel. If we go to the File menu and we're going down to Options, and then in the Save section, the choice there
Hmm.
says Save Auto Recover Information. It defaults to every 10 minutes. Well, here's the misnomer here. What this is supposed to do is you would think every 10 minutes Excel is going to create a backup. Well, it doesn't do it every 10 minutes.
Right.
It does it on kind of this random schedule. So I found if I change that to every 2 minutes, that it gives me backups more frequently. Because I can do a lot of work, and I can do a lot of work in 10 minutes. And if that 10 minutes expands to 20 minutes, then it's exponential, the more work. And so what this does, this gives me two levels of backing up. One, if Excel completely blows up, when I come back into Excel, it's going to have a copy of the file. But more importantly to me is because, let's say I'm being diligent, I'm saving my work, I've got my computer stable, I can still go through, and if I delete a worksheet, I'm penalized in two ways. One, I can't undo the deletion, the sheet's just gone, but I also can't undo anything
Hmm.
else I did prior to the deletion. So I lose my safety net. But by changing that back up there, if we go to the File menu on the Info tab, where it says version history, you'll start seeing
Hmm.
timestamps show up there. You can click there on a file and bring up a copy of the file from where it was earlier in your work session. So
Ah.
that's another way. That's my favorite way of, like, you just have that. Oh man, I didn't mean to do that. We get going too fast.
Hmm.
We're went in the wrong file or just whatever. That lets you go back in time in the current work session. So these copies get thrown away when you close the file. But
Hmm.
let's say you close the file accidentally, then under this manage workbook there, you can say recover unsaved workbooks. So if you had not saved the file, that's going to
Hmm.
put you in the unsaved workbooks folder, the unsaved files folder, and workbooks that you worked on over the last couple of days will be there. Now,
Wow. Okay.
that's by no means a permanent archive. That's
Sure.
Excel sweeps those out after 2 or 3 days. So, but if you worked on a file, and particularly for juggling multiple files, you're kind of doing a scratch file and you start closing things and muscle memory, you're like, no, no, no. And then you're like, oh, that's where you can go. But for
Uh-huh.
for all of these, it's all predicated on Excel having created that backup. So that's why under File and Options and Save, we want to get
Hmm.
that. You could even set it to every 1 minute, but 2 minutes has been, a good balance for me there. That means Excel will
Sure.
create a backup every 4 or 5 minutes, as opposed to
Hmm.
every 15 or 20 if I leave it to the default.
And so going back to that version history that you were just talking about, really, I guess if you use a lot of macros, that's going to be your best bet, right? Because anytime you use macros, your undo capability is thrown away.
Exactly. That's one of that's the sharp edge of macros. Macros let us automate lots of things, but even if you run just a simple macro, then it clears out the undo stack. And the undo
Hmm.
stack is that list of things that we can undo. That's purposeful because when you run a macro in Excel, Excel has no idea how elaborate that macro is. Doesn't know if
Hmm.
you're just changing one cell, or the most complex macro I ever had to run over the years. It was a macro that there was so much to do that it ran for like 2 hours, going through these. So there's no way that
Uh,
programming code running for 2 hours that it can keep track of all the versions and undo it. So that's why
of
we
course.
lose the ability to undo. And so, yes,
Hmm.
that versioning is definitely a way to recover from, you saved without running the macro. But that's also where many times, depending on the nature of the macro, in the macro itself, I'll build in a step where it saves the file before the macro goes. So that then if I have to, if the macro goes off track, I can close the file and I know that I've got that clean copy
Hmm.
to open back up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've really started to go down that road of macroizing so many of the little, the little formatting things and stuff like that that I do all day. I think to myself, I'll make a shortcut for that. And then what I'm trading off is throwing away all those undos every single time. So
Right. You
it's,
throw away the undos, and we have to decide. So what I think about a lot these days in Excel is what I term the death by 1,000 cuts. All
mhm,
little formatting things that, yeah, in isolation don't take very long, but if you're doing those same repetitive steps, you're frittering away your time. And so that's what
mhm,
we have to think about. Okay, what's the greater value? Being able to undo, or having it done consistently with a macro, and so you eliminate that human error. We don't
mhm.
necessarily need the undo as much,
Right.
but it always depends on the nature. Again, no hard and fast,
Oh, of course,
no
yeah.
absolutes in Excel.
you mean you
Wow.
you mean you as a trainer and consultant say the words "it depends"
it,
all the time?
it does,
I am shocked.
because people use Excel. It's remarkable watching how other people use Excel.
It really is. And that's why, even though my wife mocks me for sitting around and making spreadsheets all day of like companies that don't even exist, just doing all sorts of different things, just sitting down and talking to another person who does Excel all day, every day for 10 minutes can result in so many different ideas buzzing around in my head. That's really.
And I find we get that tunnel vision.
Hmm.
One of the areas where I've really had tunnel vision as of late is the Power Query feature in Excel, because Microsoft has done a horrible job of explaining it.
Hmm.
I would go in, and what I would find with Power Query is I would try to do things that I could do with a SQL database and hit a roadblock and then just get frustrated and throw it away. Just, I'll look at that later.
Hmm.
But recently I was watching, and I will give a shout out to Mr. Excel because he helped me get my thinking, change my thinking, spending
Uh-huh.
somebody else. And he did this little simple thing, and I had that aha. Now I get it. Now I see. And so Power Query is going to greatly inform all a lot of my presentations as we go forward.
Oh yeah.
Because in fact, the beauty of Power Query, what they're not haven't explained, it's designed to take the macros out of the equation, to let you automate these data transformations, where in effect Power Query is almost like a macro recorder where you go through and do the transformation, and then it just automatically plays the transformation back. If you have this
Yep.
file from your accounting software and you're having to split up columns and delete and filter and all that, historically we would create a macro to do that. With Power Query, you can go through and do all those steps, and then you just open your spreadsheet, and Power Query on its own does the transformation. and there's nothing for you to undo or having to lose the work or even
Mhm.
code to write. So
Exactly.
it's really a remarkable tool, and it's an opportunity for us trainers that Microsoft has done a horrible job of explaining how it works.
I love that. So, if you'll permit me, I do want to actually take a second and do a promo for Power Query.
Sure.
Power Query, the greatest thing since sliced bread. No, in all seriousness, if you are listening to us right now and wondering what this Power Query thing is and whether it's actually as good as David's talking about, it is so amazing. So, first of all, if you have Excel 2010 or 13, you have to go get an add-in for Power Query. And if you have 2016, 19, and Office 365, Power Query comes on the Data tab. So if you look at the Data tab in Excel, Power Query is that Get and Transform Data area. And one of the things that it does, like you said, it allows us to do all of that data restructuring that we would normally use macros for, and do it as something that's written out in the steps. And what's nice about that to me is if you had a macro, especially like a macro that a coworker had built at one point in time that solved some problem, the odds are good people are pushing that button and just hoping that magic happens every time, because the macro is this black box and they wouldn't know how to tweak it if the data changed even a tiny little bit. But Power Query allows us to go back to every step of the process and really clearly and easily make modifications to how it works.
And actually
I
see where the data looks like at those points.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like going through step by step through the macro, but even just actually being able to analyze how the data happens and actually see that if something breaks, there's a yellow bar and it says we tried to do this and it failed because of this. So just go back and tweak this and it'll work again. It's amazing.
And it also, which macros don't do, if you change something in your macro that affects something else in the macro, you're on your own. You're going to learn that when you run the macro. Power Query, if you
Yeah.
do something that's going to affect something else, it'll say, hey, you did this, which is going to have this other effect. And so you can just close out of your Power Query without saving the changes and then go in clean and make a new stab at it. So
Yeah.
you're talking about a disaster recovery tool, very much a disaster recovery tool. And the other thing that I like about Power Query, because many times an issue that we have is folks like to go in and tweak the data. They like to overwrite cells or whatever. Well, when you bring in data by way of Power Query, and another way Microsoft didn't do themselves any favors is they called it Get and Transform. Because when they took it from Power Query to Get and Transform, then they really lost me. And I've been using spreadsheets for 30 years, and I'm like, I don't need that. I have all this knowledge. But no, I do need Power Query. I'm converted. But my point is that when the data is brought into the spreadsheet, you're bringing in a picture of the data. If you go in and type over the data, you can right click on it and refresh it and restore its pristine again. So another huge disaster recovery, because if you're in an environment where folks go in, for that month in, they want to change these numbers, and then they compromise your financial results, you can just right click and refresh the data, and the changes they made just vanish. So it's another
Yeah.
huge safety net that we don't normally have in Excel. Normally, we have to tiptoe around and make sure, if I change this, am I going to break that? Power Query, the data brought in by Power Query has that built-in safety net.
It's really nice. I think what it does is really push us down that path of, you could treat Excel kind of like your database, right? You can have a master spreadsheet somewhere and have a bunch of different files that all query the master spreadsheet. You never have to worry about messing up the master spreadsheet because everybody's getting what they need out of it, by not even by opening it up.
And what you're also not doing is that old school method of creating workbook links. That's another huge disaster risk in Excel, where folks create formulas that link back to the master spreadsheet. And that's a feature I've observed in Excel works until it doesn't. If I'm pulling a few cells, no big deal. But I remember at one point in my career, there was someone that they had thousands of cells that they were trying to pull over from this other spreadsheet, and the workbook links just arbitrarily wouldn't update. So then their numbers didn't tie. And how do you track that down? And also, workbook links, they're very fragile because if you move the file, and granted with Power Query, if you move the original file, then that can break your query. But you don't have all those individual workbook links. You're fixing it one place. You're changing that source one place, and you're relying on Excel's calculation methods, because another thing that happens with big workbooks or bringing in lots of data, Excel will arbitrarily decide to put itself in manual calculation mode. When we go back to the 80s with, when computers were so slow, you had to put it in manual calculation mode so you didn't lose your brain waiting on it to recalculate. Well, when Excel just decides, I'm going to quit calculating, and you don't realize it and your numbers aren't changing because it just arbitrarily did that, because you had so many workbook links. So Power Query is another way to, harden your spreadsheet so that you eliminate that risk of Excel deciding to just, quit calculating.
Mm-hmm.
It does
Yes.
calculating. We just go back to the formulas menu, and then there's a calculation options button. Should generally be set to automatic these days. It's been years and years since I've had a spreadsheet where I've needed to purposefully go and put it in manual because
Mm-hmm.
it's taking too long to calculate. But Excel will arbitrarily put itself in that mode. And you can tell that the word calculate is going to appear in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, down next to where it normally says ready there. So if you see calculate there, most likely it's in manual calculation mode.
Mm-hmm.
Likely you have a circular reference somewhere, but that's a whole separate. That's a whole.
Right. It's really for simple math and things like that. But I've really started to go down the path of using Power Query in lieu of VLOOKUP for so many things,
Yeah.
because I've done the tests now. I have this video where I do 2 million VLOOKUPs side by side with the equivalent of doing the same thing in Power Query,
Uh-huh.
and the time that it takes to recalculate 2 million VLOOKUPs compared to the Power Query is ludicrous. I mean, it's just.
Well, you also can't fit two. I mean, depends. You have a million rows, so
Yeah,
you have 2 million or something. There's that too.
exactly right. Yes, and that's where earlier today I had a phone call with somebody, and they were saying, "Oh, well, we need to be able to get just the things that we need out of this. So, will we need to go back and delete what we don't need and things like that?" And I said, "Let me tell you the joy of Power Query. All you have to do in Power Query, filter by the date, and you're good to go. Now you just have those records that are relevant to you."
In the spreadsheet, the rest of the data is elsewhere, and so you're not shooting yourself in the foot by going through and deleting stuff, and then you get
Mhm.
delete stuff out to the side because you didn't realize somebody put something out to the side where they shouldn't have. And so, yes, that ability to filter. Once you have one or two instances where Power Query does what it does, then you have that aha moment. But
Mhm.
should be prepared for a little bit of trial and error and just a little bit of watching videos and reading articles on exactly how to make it work. But once you have that aha, then you're off to the races.
Mhm. I, and yet again, another conversation I'm having has turned towards Power Query. I'm astonished. Awesome. If we zoom out for a sec, or rewind a little bit, do you have anything else that you use sort of beforehand to set yourself up for success? Do you do a lot of data validation and things like that in your workbooks, or how do you like to set up for success?
One of the best things that I've done that I do in Excel on workbooks that are really crucial is in the Save As dialog box. There's a Tools button next to Save. And so I click on Tools and I click on General Options. In
Mm-hmm.
that General Options dialog box, there's a checkbox I can click that says Always Create Backup. And then
Oh, okay.
okay. And what that does for me is that creates whenever I save the file normally, it takes the previous version of the file and renames it and calls it backup of and puts it in the same folder. And
Hmm.
where that really saved me, it's been a couple years now, but I've got a cash flow spreadsheet that I've used to project my cash flow for my business. I've used that spreadsheet for 20 years. And one week on a Friday, I used the file. I came back the following Monday, and Excel says the workbook is corrupted. And normally you would just lose your brain. But because I had clicked
Yeah.
the checkbox, then I just went and opened up the backup and only lost a few minutes of work as opposed to losing the entire file. So that's another one of my, for these really crucial workbooks, just click
Mm-hmm.
that checkbox. So that one we have to turn on workbook by workbook.
Okay.
What we saw earlier was the ability to just kind of set and forget, just tell Excel in general, always create a backup every couple minutes. But this automatic backup now, and it also cuts both ways, because if you're OCD and you're saving your file every minute, then that fallback position is only a minute old. But
Mm,
does give you, and so we find that right balance on how often we need to save. But it's one of my favorite safety nets in Excel, because you just never know when you're going to need it.
beautiful.
Now, folks do ask me, can I have the backups be put someplace else? And unfortunately, you can't. The backups are in the same folder.
Okay.
And the other quirky thing, because this is Microsoft, it creates the file has a .xlk extension that
Okay.
when you go to open the XLK file, it's going to tell you that the file extension is wrong and ask you, do you really want to open this file? And don't pay attention to that. Just open the file. You think that they would have, because Microsoft dubbed it an XLK file. You would think that they would also dub it that it's okay to open an XLK file, but it doesn't. So just bypass that sky's
Yeah.
warning. Just open the file, and you'll be where you were the last time you saved it.
Nice. Well, that's fantastic. All these things, now that I've been talking to you for 20, 25 minutes, I feel like I've just been flying by the seat of my pants the whole time and just like, I'm just going, rubbing up against disaster at every turn. This is awesome. Awesome. All right. I am going to have to write all of this out, and every one of these things will be in the show notes, beyond the shadow of a doubt. Okay, fantastic. Gosh, this is amazing stuff. Those were the major ideas that I had in terms of disaster recovery. Am I missing anything in your world as far as disaster recovery that I haven't touched on yet?
I think that's the other thing that we didn't talk about. So for those big files, those
Hmm.
ones that take a long time to open Excel, because the bigger the file, the more fragile it can get. There's the default format for Excel is the .xlsx file.
Yes.
And then if we have macros in the file, we have to save it as a .xlsm file, the M signifying that there's potentially macros in it. The third format is the Excel binary workbook, has a .xlsb format. And the odd thing about Excel workbooks is that we see the workbook on the screen. In reality, behind the scenes, it's all letters and numbers. It's characters that you can read, because
Hmm.
a modern Excel file uses a format that's called XML, which is a cousin of HTML, which is what drives web pages. So anytime you're saving something in a text format, then there's an exposure there. The
Yeah.
binary workbook saves the file in a binary format, which is ones and zeros, which is referred to as machine code that only the computer can make sense of.
Hmm.
Those binary files. So one real life example, I ran a macro for a client to transform their data, ended up with a file that was 37.5 megabytes. Too big to email. I mean, there's ways to
Yeah.
email it, but you just attach it. Just simply go to Excel, say File, Save As, change that Save As type, pull down that Save As type dialog, the list, change it to a binary workbook, knocked it down to just under 10 meg. So not
Wow.
only does the footprint change, but
Hmm.
also you get it out of that more fragile, because what happens where folks kind of shoot themselves in the foot in particular is when they go to format a column, they'll click on column A and they'll change the font for a million rows. They,
Oh yeah.
they think that's a shortcut. Well, you're bulking up the file. The more formatting that you get, the more combinations of that. It used to be that there was only like 4,000 combinations of formatting that, and you could use those up pretty quick in the team environment. And then Excel would say you can't change the formatting anymore. And
Yeah.
they've
Too
upped,
many styles. Yep.
right, they've upped that to like 64,000. But still, we want to be careful. We don't want to just cavalierly format the entire row or format the entire column. You really want to focus just on the data, just apply the formatting just to the data.
Hmm.
And it's because not every file is suitable for the binary format, and you don't want to save all your files to the binary format. So from a disaster recovery standpoint, just format the data. Don't format the entire workbook. You know,
Yep. My shortcut for, I mean, I say this in basically every Excel class I ever teach:
Mhm.
Control Shift and the arrow keys,
Yes,
right? So if you have contiguous data,
right,
like you're saying, if you click on the C up at the top of the column,
right.
you are now selected on 1,000,000+ rows of the C column. And if you filled out 35 rows of the C column, you have just done 1,000,000 or 999,000, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
So you click on the top of the column, Control Shift down arrow, that selects only the data that you have there, and you can do your formatting.
You
Perfect.
can also just do Control A if you want the whole section there, and that'll
Exactly.
get the whole that contiguous block of cells.
Yep. Perfect. That's amazing stuff. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
That's good.
Uh, do you have a parting shot, a last closing tip or trick for us?
Probably just to if it's not already part of your muscle memory, Control S, where you just
Mhm.
periodically hit Control S, or if you like using the mouse, just go up to the corner and click that save button. The more often you save, the more that you're going to minimize that exposure there. It's I can't, the only silver lining to losing a spreadsheet is that the second time you build it so much faster because you know what the path is. That's
Yes, indeed.
a cold comfort, and I've just had that happen way too many times over the years. And so just use that muscle memory to your advantage. Oh, you just periodically hit Control S, and that will save you a lot of pain.
Beautiful. Well, everybody, you have just seen the amazing amount of information and experience that David's got in Excel. David's calendar is online at davidringstrom.com. This will be in the show notes. If you'd like to talk to him about customized Excel training, consultation, any kind of organization could absolutely benefit from this man's expertise. If you're an accounting educator, go to studentsexcel.com. And you're able to customize classes for individual clients, right?
Or actually, Students Excel is for accounting students.
Nice. All
Creating
right.
materials for accounting professors to be able to assign in class, because a lot of professors don't have the time or the ability to teach Excel. So video training aimed at
Mm-hmm.
students, and I do the grading. So very hands off for the instructors.
Yeah. I mean, not to throw the industry under a bus or anything, but the first time I ever taught an accounting a group of accountants about Excel, I was like, "Of course you all know about this and this and this and this,"
Yeah.
and everybody was like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "Oh, you should have known about this for a long time, guys." Yeah, that's. I mean, as much time as accountants spend in Excel, that's a core thing they have to have. Beautiful. Well, again, all of David's information will be in the show notes. Please let us know at help@knacktraining.com if you have any questions. We'll be doing Q&A at the end of these podcasts. Have a wonderful day. Thanks, everybody.